Welcome back everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm in my new house and that's why I've been away for the past couple of weeks because the move has just been quite stressful, but I am finally in the house, although most of my furniture isn't, but I didn't want to miss any more time, so I thought I would come back with a new video today. A few weeks ago I found the Canterbury Tales BookTube tag, which has 25 questions that are all based on the Canterbury Tales, and you don't have to have read the tales in order to appreciate this tag. Instead, they just use prompts that are based on the characters and the themes of the poem and ask questions around that. So don't worry, you don't need to go and read the Canterbury Tales in order to watch this video. But as there are so many prompts, I should just get into the video and get started. So here we go. The host is the character who relates the tales to the reader. He is large, loud and merry. Recommend a mammoth book over 800 pages. Well, I could certainly go with the Canterbury Tales for this because although it is a very well-known book, I don't know how very well read it is. And it is just fantastic. And even if you have read it, you may have only read a modern translation of it, which is what I did when I first read it, but I'm currently digging deep into the original translation and I am really enjoying it. And surprisingly, the language is not all that difficult to get the grasp of. If you understand English and you read it out loud especially, it just starts to kind of, intuitively you just sort of get a sense for what's going on. So don't be put off by the ancient language. These are some of the most amazing stories and amazing characters in all of literature, so it's definitely worth digging into. But if I wasn't going to recommend the Canterbury Tales, I would recommend maybe another, even less well-read and less well-known old epic, Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. You've got various knights and each one represents a kind of virtue and they go on a quest and it's kind of very traditional, and like I say, it can seem stuffy when you first read it. But what really got me into The Fairy Queen was Camille Parlier's essay on The Fairy Queen, which is in her book Sexual Personae, and she really digs deep into the sexual undertones of the tales and the androgyny and the cross-dressing of, say, the female knight Britomart and all this stuff, and she really brought The Fairy Queen to life for me. So I'd recommend not only reading this epic, it's 1,200 pages, so it will definitely qualifies, but also read her essay alongside it if you think it's a bit stuffy, because I think it will just show you that there's so much going on there, more than you could think, especially on a first read. So those would be my recommendations for Mammoth books. The knight stands for fighting, war and bravery. Recommend a book with a courageous main character. With this, I'm going to go with the Aeneid by Virgil. The main character here in this story being Aeneas, who is kind of a mythological figure who is seen to have founded Rome, or at least that's what the story tries to imply. I really enjoyed the Aeneid when I read it. I enjoyed it, I think, even more than I enjoyed the Odyssey, and definitely more than the Iliad, which I struggled with. And what I like about the Aeneid is that it kind of has both elements, kind of the best parts of the Odyssey and the Iliad, and combines it into one tale. The first part is very much like the Odyssey in that you have Aeneas leaving Troy after it's been destroyed and going on his own kind of adventure in a similar way to Odysseus going on his journey in the Odyssey. And then in the second half you have this big battle, which very much reminds me a lot of the Iliad, where you just have violence upon violence upon violence, all these characters dying. It's just really, really over the top, but it's not quite as long as the Iliad, so that's why I kind of prefer it. But also, I think Virgil is just a fantastic poet, and I really enjoyed this one when I read it. And so if it's one that you haven't read, I would definitely recommend it. The Wife of Bath stands for marriage, sex, and arguing. Recommend a book with a strong female character. For me, that's definitely no question going to be Night at the Circus by Angela Carter, and the main character in this book is probably one of the strongest female characters I've ever come across, and that is Feathers. Feathers is a trapeze artist who actually has real wings, and she seems to represent the idea, or the kind of paradigm idea, of the liberated woman. She is vivacious, she's witty, she's charming, she's sexual, she's just everything out in a completely outrageous way, and it's absolutely wonderful. And one of the reasons why I think Night at the Circus is Angela Carter's best book is pretty much just because of this character alone. It's definitely Carter's most striking character. It's up there with Dickens in my mind. The ability to create those characters that, even if they're not the most deep and psychologically complex, if you think about it in terms of theatrical terms, they just come to life, leap out of the page, and just stick with you forever. So definitely going to be Feathers for me, and Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus. The Pardoner is all about ambiguity. Tell us about your favourite queer characters. I think for me that's going to be a somewhat understated queer character, at least by today's standards, and that is Will Rabjohns, which is a character from Clive Barker's book Sacrament. Clive Barker, until this point, he'd had queer characters in his stories, but they always were kind of either in his short stories, the Books of Blood, or they were secondary characters, not the primary character. But with Sacrament, he decided to finally tell a story with a gay lead character. And in fact, when he sent the book to his publisher, the publisher actually said, could you just change the romantic lead in this story to female, because he just really wasn't happy with this and obviously thought that the book wouldn't sell. Barker said no, and the book actually did sell. Now it is still, it's not kind of ranked up there with his best works, but I think it is a fantastic story. And in fact, I think the reason why maybe it's not ranked among his best is because in it, Barker is kind of not really focusing all that much on the horror and the fantasy as much. In fact, the best parts of this book are the early parts of Will's life, the kind of flashback scenes to his childhood, where he's growing up and understanding his sexuality, becoming a part of that as well. But what I like about that is it's just a part of this character. It's an aspect of his personality, but it's not him. It's not that the story is, about his sexuality. He just happens to be a gay character, and you happen to have then scenes that deal with that, but it's not the focus of the story. And I really like that. I like that Barker is able to tell a story that's kind of like an everyman sort of kind of queer character, as opposed to something that's more fantastical or idealistic. So I think that's a really good example of that. Another book, though, that I would recommend that's a bit more broad in terms of its representation of queer characters would be City of Night by John Rechy. This story covers the exploits of a young man who goes to various cities across America as a rent boy, essentially. And he meets all kinds of characters, from transgender people to drag queens to, I think, lesbians and gay men, of course, and even straight men who are just kind of, doing this for money. There's all kinds of characters in there and a whole host of them. So if you want a book that really does focus more on queer experiences, I definitely recommend that one. The Miller is bold, blasphemous, and overturns conventions. What is your favourite naughty character? Naughty is a weird word here. I feel like maybe I'm taking naughty too far by recommending Pinky from Brighton Rock. Brighton Rock is about gang violence in the 1930s, I want to say. I don't know the exact decade, but Pinky is one of the lead characters in this story. He's a 17-year-old, and he begins the story by killing someone, and the story eventually basically follows his downfall from this point and his becoming worse and worse. And he is kind of a really terrible character. Maybe in a different life he could have just been a sort of mischievous rogue type, but not anymore. In this book, he's certainly gone down that dark path. Maybe he's a bit too naughty for this prompt. Maybe it was more like mischievous, in which case maybe Peeves from Harry Potter would be a good suggestion. But yeah, I think Pinky is a great example of kind of a delinquent youth that just goes off the deep end, and so I think that's a good reason to pick him for this one. If you've not read Brighton Rock, I'd definitely give it a go. The Prioress is modest, quiet, and compassionate. Recommend a book that you don't hear much about on YouTube. But in addition to answering this question, I'll also pick a book that the Prioress would certainly blush at, if not scream and burn in a fire at, and that is Juliet by the Marquis de Sade. Usually if people talk about Sade, they talk about 120 Days of Sodom, or they talk about Justine. And I think that is quite a shame, because 120 Days of Sodom wasn't finished, and Justine is a wonderful novel, but I think it really needs to be read with Juliet in mind, and ideally you want to read both, because I think if you just read Justine, it gives you a very one-sided understanding of what Sade is all about. Juliet is a sister novel to Justine, and Juliet herself is Justine's sister. And unlike Justine, who is pure, virtuous, very much like the Prioress, Juliet is not that. She is a libertine, she's evil, and she doesn't care. She does all kinds of inhumane, terrible, and often disgusting things throughout the 1,200-page novel, which is probably why most people haven't read it, because I can tell you it took me, I think, over 6 months to get through that, because you just can't read something like that consistently. But yeah, I would definitely recommend reading it, and it's not something, like I said, I think I'm the only person, maybe not, but I think I'm one of the only people who's done a review of Juliet on YouTube, so it's definitely a book that I would like to hear more about. And also just Sade in general. He's known as a figure, but I feel like people often don't really get to grips with the kind of philosophical content in his work, which I think actually is quite rewarding and very impressive for the time that he was writing in. Basically all of the atheistic arguments that you hear now are to be found in Sade, along with many other arguments as well. So definitely worth a read, and definitely an overlooked book in Sade's catalogue. The monk cares little for rule and prayer. Tell us about an unconventional character. Again, maybe I'm interpreting unconventional in a bit too much of a dark way, but I'm going to go with Humbert Humbert from Lolita for this one. He's unconventional because of what he's attracted to, i.e. young girls. But I also think what's interesting about Humbert Humbert is he's also just eccentric and weird outside of that kind of shock value part of him. He is just a weird person altogether, and like the way, his narrative voice is just bizarre. He's always, on the one hand he's like this bumbling sort of buffoonish type, and on the other hand he's this insidious creep that you really just don't want to read any more about. And I just find that really interesting, to get into the mind of someone who's just so warped, and how he sees the world is just so different from how a normal person would see the world. So I'm going to go with Humbert Humbert from Lolita. The Friar is all about confession. Have you read any holy books all the way through? The only holy book I've read all the way through was the Bible, which I did last year, and I decided to try and do that in a year, reading 3 pages a day or thereabouts. Sometimes I had to read more because I had to catch up, because it's quite hard to commit to something like that. But I managed to do it, and it was grueling in places, it was rewarding in other places, and I was surprised in many places. People talk about the Bible all the time, and it was great to finally read the words and see what all the fuss was about, essentially. And by and large, I do think it was worth it, and I think it's a text I will return to again, although probably not in that way. I'll probably just pick certain books that I enjoyed and want to read again and understand in a bit more depth. The Summoner is a lecherous drunk who tries to sound better than he is. Tell us about a book that sounded better than it was. I think for this I'm going to have to go with Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is a series that I was just underwhelmed by it. I read the first book and I enjoyed it. It wasn't a bad book by any stretch, but the kind of blurb suggests, it's this book where the evil lord is the winner, and the bad guy's won kind of setup, and people rave about Sanderson like he's the new big thing. So I was really, my expectations were really high for this, and I thought the first book was good enough to get the second one after a long pause. But I did get the second book. I read it, and again, at the end of it, it was fine, but I just haven't had the impulse to buy the third book, and I still haven't. And I read the second book, I think, last year, quite early on. I don't know exactly, but I read it a while ago now, and I just have no interest. I just don't find Sanderson's writing style engaging to me. I don't really like his magic system. I think it feels too much like a video game, and it's too scientific and explained. Well, it tries to be, but then also it's just kind of confusing, which is odd. If you kind of take that precise, hard magic system style, you'd expect it to be more concrete and more easy to understand what's going on, but that's not the case. So yeah, it just didn't do anything for me, really. And I do want to read The Way of Kings still, because people, I have heard people say that Mistborn isn't his best and that The Way of Kings is, again, fantastic. But then I've also seen, I think it's just Sean Reader's quite negative review of that, so maybe I would agree with him on this. But yeah, he's a writer that I don't think is personally to my taste, although I do like what he did with The End of the Wheel of Time, so I will give him credit for that. The Parson is poor but rich in thoughts and deeds. Tell us about a book that gave you more than you expected. This one is going to be easy. It's going to be Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. The Little Friend is Donna Tartt's second book, in between the very well regarded The Secret History and also The Goldfinch. And it's usually seen as kind of an ugly duckling. People don't like it. People think it's just this long, rambling, boring mess that doesn't go anywhere. And I can certainly see why, given the way the story ends, people would think that, because it doesn't end with this climactic sort of moment in the way that maybe you might expect it to. And it sets itself up to be one thing, a murder mystery, and then just goes completely in another direction, which I think was a funny misdirect from Tartt, because I think probably what she was doing there, or maybe what she was doing there, was she knew that she had a reputation of writing that sort of style of book with The Secret History, and so she subverted the reader's kind of expectations. And if that's what she was doing, I think it's quite clever, and I think that the story that she does give is even better than a murder mystery. The lead character is just so interesting. As a child character, she's up there with the best child characters. Psychologically complex, but also believable as a child. It's just such a good story, and I think it's a real shame that it's overlooked. And obviously the reason why I got more out of it than I expected is because I wasn't expecting to find this story to be all that great. I thought it would probably be good, because Tartt is a competent writer, but I wasn't expecting to love it, but I definitely did by the end. The squire stands for youth, beauty and courting. What book did you fall in love with when you were a youth? Going to pick some obvious ones for this, unfortunately, if you're expecting anything exciting, but I'm going to go with The Chronicles of Narnia, The Series of Unfortunate Events, and Harry Potter. And I think I'm going to put Narnia ahead of the other two, because that world was the first one of these three to really capture me when I was very young as a child. And in fact, it was more the BBC TV adaptation of them that really wowed me, but they wowed me enough to get the books, and equally, I also love those books. After that, I think it would probably be a toss-up between Series of Unfortunate Events and Harry Potter. I think I like both of them for very different reasons. I think the world that Lemony Snicket creates is more consistent and strange and intriguing. Even to an adult, I find that world fascinating. And I think there's a lot of subtext in the Series of Unfortunate Events, mysteries and things you just don't pick up on when you're a young reader. And I remember buying The Bad Beginning on a camping trip, and I think I bought the first one, the sixth one. I can't remember the other one that I bought, just because they were the only ones there. And I read the first one and the sixth one, and I was just like, wow, this is amazing. You know, just addicted immediately to the story. Whereas Harry Potter actually took me a bit of a while to get into. I was a bit late to the kind of hype train with Harry Potter, so it doesn't have the same youthful nostalgia to me as the other two, but also a fantastic story. I think J.K. Rowling is an amazing world builder specialist, and so yeah, that's going to be my three choices for that, but I'm going to put Narnia ahead of the other two. The Clerk says little, but his words are wise and virtuous. Tell us about a short book that made you a better person. I mean, if we're going with fiction, then to be honest, I can't really think of a story that does that, just because I don't really read stories in that way. I don't really read stories in order to become a better person. I read them for pleasure and enjoyment, and you know, I can certainly see what authors are trying to do in their works, but oftentimes when an author starts moralizing, and you know, it doesn't end well with me, but thinking maybe more about philosophy, I wouldn't say that there are any books that made me a more virtuous person. I'd say there were some short books in moral philosophy that I found very interesting. You know, Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, a very short book where he presents, you know, the key aspects of his moral theory. I also recently read Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness, primarily because it's a topic that always comes up, and I just wanted to actually know what she actually had to say, rather than listening to other people who oftentimes have only read secondary texts, say, you know, kind of saying what she actually said. And she gives a very interesting analysis of what selfishness is, and I think it would actually surprise a lot of people if they understood what she means by selfishness, because she doesn't really mean what we normally mean when we use the term in everyday language. So I don't think the book would have, you know, made me a better person, because I didn't really agree with everything that Round said, but I did find it a very interesting book, and it is very short, so I will give those as my answers. Kant and Ayn Rand, who apparently she hated him, so I like that I can put them together there. The man of law upholds justice and knows the laws by heart. Tell us about a book that you could not imagine rereading. I mean, I could go with Mistborn again, because, you know, I can't even imagine finishing the series, let alone rereading the other books. But instead I will go with Martin Amis's Money, which is a book I read for a book club, and it was one of those books that I did just read in order to finish it, because it was very boring. I didn't find the main character interesting. It's about the excess in the 80s, and the guy is just a schmuck. He drinks a lot, he takes lots of drugs, he's an absolute mess of a person, and then at the end there's like a sort of half-hearted attempt at making him empathetic that doesn't quite work. I don't know. It did not interest me as a book at all, and I can barely remember it outside of those vague things. So yeah, I'm going to have to go with Money by Martin Amis for that one. The Manciple provides food. Recommend a book series that is great from start to finish. This one is tricky, partly because I haven't really read many complete series. The Narnia books, there are some duds in there. I would like to say Gormenghast, the Gormenghast trilogy, but I haven't actually read the third book, and apparently the third book isn't as good as the first two, but the first two are just spectacular. I didn't finish Lord of the Rings, so I can't say that. So I think I'm going to have to go with Harry Potter, just because I think it's the only series that I've actually read from start to finish, because there are lots of fantasy series out there that aren't finished, you know, Game of Thrones, for example, that I think could do it, or the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch. I've really enjoyed the books so far, but again, not finished. So I'm going to go with Harry Potter. I really don't think that there are any bad books in the series. A lot of people complain about the Chamber of Secrets, which I've never understood. I think the Chamber of Secrets is fabulous. I actually prefer it to the first book. Mainly because it actually scared the crap out of me when I was a kid, the snake thing. So I just remember it a lot more. And I like the whole snake thing. It's creepy and gothic in a way that the first book isn't. So yeah, I'm going to go with Harry Potter. I really don't think that there is a bad book in that series. The merchant deals in furs and cloth, and is powerful and wealthy. Recommend a book with a powerful message or theme. For this, I mean, I've read a lot of books that have powerful messages and themes, but I'm going to go with Virginia Woolf's The Waves. I think The Waves is just a fantastic book, and I think it's a shame that, people remember Woolf for Mrs. Dalloway and maybe To the Lighthouse, but The Waves to me is definitely by like a landslide her best work. In it she follows 6 characters, 3 guys, 3 girls, and they all have their own voice, they kind of speak in monologues, and we go through their entire lives, or almost most of their lives, and it's just fantastic. I think that Woolf really perfects her craft in this book. I just wasn't bored for a moment, and it's a book that I'm definitely, I can just see myself rereading time and time again. And what I like is because you're aging with these characters, every time you reread it, if you've aged with them, you'll then take a new perspective on the book. So not only is this a fantastic book with great themes around aging and life and those big sweeping things, but I think it's definitely a book that you should try and read as young as possible so that you can relate to the early parts of the story and then reread it again and reread it again every time you move on to a different stage of life, because I think that's just the perfect way to appreciate a book like that. The Shipment is a wine-stealing rascal. Tell us about a side character who steals the spotlight. Well, there's only going to be one character in my mind that I can think of, and that is Lestat from Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series. In fact, this character stole the spotlight so much that only Louis, who was the protagonist for the first book, is no longer the protagonist after that book, and pretty much every other book focuses on Lestat instead. So I think that's not only an example of a character who steals the spotlight for the reader, but also a character who stole the spotlight for the author and became essentially a kind of lifelong fictional lover for Anne Rice. Lestat is also just outside of that a fantastic character. Again, one of these larger-than-life theatrical characters that I really enjoy and get a lot out of. The physician knows what ails you and can cure it. Tell us about your favourite comfort reads. Well, mostly for comfort reads, I tend to read books that I read when I was a kid, so those will be the ones that I've already talked about. But also, I think other children's books, and The Christmas Carol is a good example of one because I read that every year at Christmas, and I just really enjoy the story. And I think that's just how it is. I think pretty much anything that I read a long time ago, I would read as a comfort read. But also, I guess, I do enjoy some trashy fiction. So I recently read the Donoghue series by V.C. Andrews. I would say that was a comfort read, even though the themes were pretty dark. But in general, if I just want to relax and feel kind of safe, then I would more likely read a book that I read when I was a kid, even if it's not necessarily a children's book. But yeah, those would usually be my comfort reads. The Franklin is not a vassal or a noble, but a free man. Recommend a book about freedom in any form. I think for me, I'm going to go with Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake. I think, especially the first 2 books, they're very much about the ways in which traditions can crush a person. And we see that not just in the characters that inhabit the world of Gormenghast, but also the place. It's this huge, sprawling, ancient place that goes on like a labyrinth for miles, oppressing everyone who is inside it and everyone who is around it. And Titus Groan, the main character, is someone who, through the first 2 novels, rises up and becomes a free person. He won't be bound by those traditions anymore. He will rise above it, and he will leave and start a new life for himself. He won't just be the next in line to the throne, doing the same rituals and going through the same things again. So I think I would go with that. Not only is it a good story about freedom, but it's also just a fantastic story. And when it comes to the big kind of epic fantasy things that we always think of, Lord of the Rings, but I think Gormenghast is equally on par, if not maybe even better than the Lord of the Rings. Maybe you disagree. I mean, the world building in Lord of the Rings maybe is a bit more, there's more to it, there's a bigger world, but I don't know. Gormenghast is just a fantastic story and a great story about freedom, in my opinion. The Reeve is believable on the outside, but lies on the inside. What book was different than the blurb led you to believe? For me, that's going to be Anna Kavan's Ice, which is a fantastically bizarre book about, possibly it's all the fantastical ravings of a heroin addict, or it's about a woman who is being pursued by a very malignant and creepy guy throughout a nuclear wasted landscape. It could be either of those things, we don't really know, and even then it's just so bizarre. Like the time sequence is all a mess. It's really hard to follow, it's just so confusing, and obviously the blurb couldn't really do that justice. The blurb kind of just picked up on this sort of woman being chased through nuclear disaster, so it seemed like it would just be a dystopian, apocalyptic kind of story, but actually no, it's just an absolute insane story, and the blurb couldn't do it justice. Also, I could just say to this, pretty much any book that sells today, because the amount of books now that just don't even have decent blurbs on because they just have irritating reviews from newspapers or critics, and I just hate that, because obviously you're going to put the review that says it's a magnificent book on the front, because why would you put a crap review on? It's just dumb. It doesn't make me buy the book. In fact, usually if I see obnoxious quotes like that on the front of a book, I'll probably just won't buy the book because it irritates me that much, and because it just doesn't tell you anything about the book. Obviously people like it. Great, I don't care. So yeah, I'll go with Anna Kavan's Ice, but also just any book that uses those dumb quotes on the front that tell you nothing about the content of the book. The Playerman is good-hearted and faithful. Tell us about a book that you read again and again. Well, for me, that's going to be Wuthering Heights. I have probably lost count now of how many times I've read this book. I read it at least once a year and have been doing that for quite a few years, and some years I read it more than once, like when I did my Reader's Guide series, and also one year I had it for a book club, so I read it again for that. But usually I read it at least once a year, usually in the late autumn to winter period, because I just think it's a great book for that time of year. I just sit down in a dark room, or vaguely dark room, and try and read the whole thing in a day. I really like to do that sometimes if I know I have an entire day, because it will take me a whole day to read a book. I will try and read the whole thing, because you just really get lost into a story if you just sit and just read the whole thing. And not reading it like speed, but just slowly reading it throughout the day. It's just really like doing that, although it's quite hard to do, because it takes a lot of will to sit there in one place and read, especially for me, because I often tend to fall asleep when I read, so it is quite hard to do, but I really enjoy doing it with that book, and it's definitely a book that I will read who knows how many more times before the end comes for me. The Guildsmen are 5 men who act as a unit and stand for brotherhood or sisterhood. Recommend a book with an ensemble cast of characters. Well, of the books I've read, there's only one that could possibly be mentioned here, and that's going to be The Wheel of Time. This is a book that not only has an ensemble cast, in the sense that it's 14 books long and has characters spanning an entire world, but even point of view characters, it's an ensemble cast. I actually don't know what the number is for the amount of point of view characters in The Wheel of Time, but I think it is incredibly high over the course of the whole story. Even just the main characters, there's about 6 of them, and then you have your kind of secondary main characters, maybe you've got 5 or 6 more, and then you've got all of the side characters, whether it's the Aes Sedai, who are the kind of magic users. There are plenty of those that we get perspectives from, whether it's the Forsaken, who are the villains, and I think there are 13 in total of those, and they all have point of view chapters, whether it's other nobles, there are just hundreds of characters in that book, and many of these characters are fantastic and you remember them, although I will admit some of the really secondary or tertiary point of view characters do just sort of fade into the background of the mind, but still it's a pretty strong ensemble of characters, especially when we're thinking about the kind of top tier characters. They're all very distinctive, they all have their own voices, their own personalities, which is very impressive because usually it's quite hard to do a convincing novel where you have a lot of characters like that. So Wheel of Time, no question. The cook makes food that feeds you. Tell us about a book that feeds your soul. I do think that's a bit of a silly question, but I will give an answer to it because I think I should give an answer, and I'll go with Dante's The Divine Comedy for this one. I'm not a Christian by faith or anything, but I just found this book incredibly moving on a spiritual level. The journey that Dante takes through hell, the inferno, and then up through purgatory, and then through heaven, is just amazing. And I listened to this as an audiobook on a long drive that I did to this new house and then back up. And then I was so taken in by it that I then bought a physical copy of it and then read the whole thing to myself out loud. And just, wow, I've never had an experience where a book hit me like that before. So I'm going to say The Divine Comedy. Definitely read that one if you haven't. The Yeoman Serves You. Tell us about a book that served its purpose, that did what you wanted it to do. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. For this, I'm going to go with the Donoghue series. I do think that V.C. Andrews has an interesting writing style, but as I said in my review, it's a weird kind of writing style, and I'm not sure if it's great. I just think it's interesting because it's just very distinctive. I think that the first book is actually pretty good, I think the other books are a bit silly, but I'm just entertained by them, and that is what she said that she wanted to do, and she did it. So I can't really criticize her as a writer. I just think that she wrote solid books that, you know, they're not going to change your life. It's not Dante's Divine Comedy by any stretch, but they're just entertaining books that you can sit down, enjoy, and, you know, take your mind off of things and focus on the terrible lives of other characters so that you can feel a bit better about your own. So yeah, I'm going to go with V.C. Andrews and the Dollanganger series for that one. The Second Nun talks about a saint's life in her tale. What is a book you talk about a lot? Well, that's going to be Wuthering Heights again. I don't want to repeat myself too much with my answers, but I've talked about Wuthering Heights a lot. I've got a whole reader's guide on Wuthering Heights. I'd mention it in every other video, so I'm just going to have to say Wuthering Heights. Outside of that, maybe Angela Carter, and probably in the future it's going to be the Divine Comedy or Gormenghast, but, you know, at the moment, Wuthering Heights, simple as that. The Nun's priest is witty and doesn't take himself too seriously. Recommend a book with a witty lead character. For me, that's going to be Loch Lamora from the Lies of Loch Lamora, or more broadly, the Gentleman Bastard series. This is probably one of my favourite, if not my favourite, modern fantasy series. Loch Lamora is just a fantastic character. He's sharp, he's quick, he's witty, you know, he has flaws, psychologically complex, and the world around him is also fantastic. And his relationship with his friend, Vaughan, is also wonderful. But as a character, I just think he's great. You know, fantasy novels have a tendency to be quite stuffy. The characters tend to speak in a very archaic, stilted style, and, you know, that's not great sometimes. You know, sometimes it's fine. But what I like about Loch Lamora and the series is that the characters just have really sharp dialogue. They sound like real people. You know, they're not kind of bound up with all these formalities in the way that a lot of fantasy characters are. So I think I'm going to have to say him. I think he's a wonderful character, and if you've not read that fantasy series, you definitely should. Alright, that is it for this tag. I think my removal van is just about to arrive as well, so I managed to get that done in the time that I wanted. Please let me know in the comments how you would answer these questions. I look forward to discussing all this with you in the comments, and I also look forward, now that I have moved, to be making regular videos once again. Take care everyone, ta-ra!